Hello and welcome to another video review. This is the Samaritan Paradox for PC. This is a point-and-click adventure game developed by Faravid Interactive and published by Screen 7 in April of this year, and it struck me as an interesting idea once I had actually looked at the information available on the game, and the only reason I knew it existed is because I got it in a bundle. I hadn't seen any advertisements or anything like that for it, so I didn't even know it existed until I actually got it. So the question there is, did this pretty much unknown indie adventure game come along and surprise me pleasantly, or what happened exactly? Well, before we really get into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation, which is about what you would expect from an indie adventure game studio title. It looks okay, it's retro styled, it's pixel art, there's a decent amount of detail, it reminds you a lot of the Sierra adventures actually. The only issue I really had with a lot of it is that the color scheme is fairly bland in most places, so it doesn't really have a lot that pops out to the eye and all that sort of thing. But it looks fine for what it is. I would have preferred more detail and more color in it, but I can live with what it is. The sound design, on the other hand, is a bit more of a mixed bag. On the one hand, you have a pretty decent soundtrack, actually. They did a pretty good job with it. It works fairly well. The sound effects work. That's kind of it. That's all you really need, I guess. But unfortunately, there's nothing that really pops out there. And then there's the voice acting. Now, that is one of the touted features of this game. And unfortunately, the voice acting isn't all that great. I think part of it is because the game is set in Sweden in the 80s. And on top of that, it was developed by Swedes, who don't learn American English. They learn British English, which means that the translation is into British English. And so you have people with American accents speaking British English with American accents. It sounds incredibly odd. So that's really the main issue I had with the voice acting. It works, and they play their roles decently enough, but it does sound kind of amateurish, and that whole sounding like British English but spoken by Americans thing just sounds really, really odd to a native English speaker. Whether you're obviously speaking British or Australian or whatever version of English you're speaking, it just sounds odd. Just having the wildly different accent compared to what you're actually hearing the characters say. But I don't know whether that's just an issue in translation or whether I should put that on the choice of voice actors or not, but it is a bit of a detriment to the game, considering it can take you out of the experience. But obviously what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is actually a frame story. And in the frame story, you play as Ord Solomon. He's a cryptologist who's working on his doctorate thesis, and he ends up basically hitting a wall with that and not really knowing where to go, and ends up finding this secret code in a book that his friend got him, written by a famous author who had died recently. And so he ends up contacting the writer's daughter and finding out that there's a possible hidden fortune that this lost novel will lead to. From there, you end up going on this quest to find the bits of the novel as well as this lost fortune, and it expands from there. But the story within the story is actually the novel itself, where you play as a woman named Freya, who doesn't know who she is, or why she is where she is, or any of that sort of thing. And so during that particular part of the story, you're basically trying to piece together all of this stuff going on within that, and throughout the game you'll go back and forth between these two stories, and it's an interesting way of doing the plot, but at the same time it can be kind of confusing figuring out where you're supposed to go next, because certain clues are hidden behind certain things. And if you don't know where to look, you're going to be confused and just wander around for a while until eventually you find something, and it can get kind of frustrating sometimes. There's also some moments where you'll look at a puzzle and you'll not really understand where the solution might be or what it might be, and you find out that you had to go through one part of the story or the other in order to actually find out what's going on with that. So having the frame story is an interesting way of doing it, but it can be a bit confusing sometimes. You just have to pay attention to what you're doing and take notes. Lots of notes. That said, how's the gameplay itself? Well, I'm actually pretty happy to report that they did work the idea that he's a cryptologist into the game itself. There is a lot of ciphering you have to do. And it is great that they actually decided to work the character's backstory and all that into the actual gameplay mechanics, as opposed to just having it there as an explanation for why he is doing what he is doing. That said, if you don't know anything about codes and ciphers and that sort of thing, it can be a problem because you may not know what to look for. In fact, there were some puzzles where I just had no clue where to proceed and ended up having to look up a walkthrough just to go through that particular puzzle. And after the fact, I just looked at it and went, well, how am I supposed to figure that out? If you're not hardwired to think like a cryptologist, well, you're going to have some issues with this particular game. Does that make it bad? Not necessarily. A lot of these puzzles are fairly clever, actually, and it is great to actually have an adventure game with clever puzzles in them. But there's just certain issues where you'll run into these puzzles and you'll just hit a brick wall. You're just not sure where to proceed, and you'll end up wandering around aimlessly for a while trying to figure out where you missed something, or if you missed something. And it might be in the simplest of places, or it might just be something you have to go look up. There are instances where that is the case, and in those particular instances it can be kind of irritating, because if you don't know it, well, that's a problem. It's kind of expecting you to know things, and I think part of it is because it was developed by Swedes and is set in Sweden. They just kind of assume you know some things about Sweden sometimes, and they just kind of assume you know certain things about certain things, and you don't necessarily know certain things about certain things. So that can be a problem. But there's nothing in the game that is unsolvable. There's nothing in there that's going to leave you scratching your head so much that you just say, screw this, and give up. At worst, you can look up a walkthrough just for that specific puzzle and be like, oh, well, that's how you do it. Some of them are timing based. A lot of them are just ciphering or trying to find the right order for certain things, such like that. There is a lot of trial and error, and it reminds me more of really old adventure games than it does the newer ones, as in the mid to late 90s, as opposed to the early 90s and late 80s. It reminds me more of the late 80s, early 90s adventure games, where it did leave a lot more up to you trying to figure things out yourself, which I do appreciate, but better hints would be appreciated sometimes. Let's put it that way. At any rate, overall, I would say the Samaritan Paradox is a pretty decent adventure game. It's nothing amazing, but it's something I can recommend. It's not at a particularly nasty price point. You can certainly pick it up for a decent price. I believe it's $10 normally, so it'll probably go on sale fairly often. But it was something that kind of came out of nowhere. I wasn't really expecting it, and when I went to it, I was pleasantly surprised. I didn't really like how the story turned out. It seemed like it just threw things at you just all of a sudden out of nowhere, just because. And some of the things in it just seemed a bit absurd and wrapped up too nicely. But other than that, it was a pretty decent adventure game. Obviously, the issue of not knowing where to proceed notwithstanding, but that's mostly because I don't think like a cryptologist, so. Overall, Samaritan Paradox is a solid enough adventure game where if you're a fan of the genre, you'll probably be able to get something out of it. But if you're not a fan of the genre, you probably won't be able to get all that much out of it. You might find it a decent adventure game, but it's really something that's more suited to actual adventure game fans who know how to think like adventure game logic and that sort of thing. So overall, I give it a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.
At nightfall.